My story isn't very long or as nearly as creepy as some of the other ones, but it was pretty creepy to me. To this day, my crazy mum goes around saying shit like she has the gift and all sorts of nonsense. One day I was sitting on the couch in the middle of the living room watching TV after coming home from school. I can't remember how old I was, but I believe I was in middle school. My grandma was standing behind me and talking to me. She eventually starts telling me to stop watching TV and go do my homework because my mum is coming home soon. I don't remember what happens next. I think I zoned out, but my grandma says different. My grandma says that she made the comment about doing the homework. I said in a slow, drawn-out voice that I didn't have to do my homework because Mummy wasn't coming home. The house phone rung right after I said it. I remember the phone ringing. My grandma answers the phone and gives a look of horror. I have never seen anyone in my life give this look. After hanging up the phone, she tells me to get my things because we need to leave. My mum was just in a car accident and we needed to go to the hospital. I have my share of unbelievably creepy stuff that's happened to me. I'm always somewhat uneasy about sharing it because, as a skeptic, I'd normally call this kind of story bullshit, just like my parents and my friends would tell me. I was always the kid that made up stories, but this one is real. I shared a room with my sister around the age of 7, but she was off at a sleepover party the night it happened. As a little kid, I was terrified of a lot of things. I'd never seen anything close to a horror film, not even The Nightmare Before Christmas, because of how jumpy I was. So naturally, the dark freaked me out. I was really nightmare prone, which caused everyone to say this is a dream. But this was different. It was more vivid, too realistic to be a dream. I was hiding under my sheets like the cowardly kid that I was, while I decided to poke my head out to get some cool air. And then I saw something in my room. Something clearly not human. I called it an alien at the time because that's the closest thing that my horror-ignorant mind could liken it to. Now I see it more similar to the rake or the mothman. Its head was big and egg-shaped, like those stereotypical grey aliens, far too big for its tiny, slender body. It was totally naked. Pale grey or ashen white skin. The lack of light made it difficult to tell. All the bones were visible. Its tiny shriveled sack and penis just hung there between its legs. Its hands were way too big for the toothpick-like arms. It was standing at a really unnatural angle. Its eyes were totally black and shiny, seemed to be the only feature on its weird head, and were sunken in the little red holes. Most unsettling of all, it was just staring at me. After a few seconds of being completely paralysed in fear, I pulled the covers back over my head. What else could I do? I stayed there for the rest of the night until I fell asleep. I know this thing wasn't human. I told my parents the next day, and they said I was dreaming. I made up a lot of stories back then, really. I remember a lot of them vividly, and the rest of my childhood is really, really hazy. But seeing that thing in my room is one of the most childhood memories that stuck with me. I have no idea what it was, and despite my fascination with horror stories, I don't think I want to. I've had a few strange and creepy experiences growing up. The creepiest by far, though, was when I was in high school. It was summer, and my mother had left her laptop home for me to use to pass the time during the day, since she had left me no chores that day. Our house, an old two-storey building that was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It has hardwood floors throughout the first floor and carpeted on the second. Because of the age of the building, and the fact that it was a second story added later, no matter where you are upstairs, you can often hear and feel when someone is walking around downstairs. If you've ever lived in an old house with hardwood floors, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So one evening, I was laying out on the floor in my room while I was using the computer. I remember hearing my stepdad drive onto the driveway at the back of the house. Hopping to my feet, I looked through the navy blue curtains. I could see the red hue of his burgundy Chevy. I immediately laid back down and told my friend that I had to log off. Stepfather was home and was going to be pissed that I was using my mother's computer, even if it was with permission. Around this point, I heard him set the alarm on his car, walk up to the porch, fumble with his keys and lumber into the den where he heavily dropped his stuff. I cursed under my breath and hastily logged off, slinking my way down the stairs, ready to take my licks. However, when I got to the stairwell, I noticed the lights were all off downstairs still. I thought, that's fine. Sometimes he doesn't turn the lights on. It's his house. He knows where stuff is. So I force a nervous chuckle and head down the rest of the stairs, into the darkness of the first floor. Sorry about using her laptop. She said I could. Silence greeted my words. Odd, I thought. Usually he chides me or otherwise takes me down a notch. Thinking he is in the bathroom, I set the laptop on the couch in the den and begin to leave. It was then, as my eyes finished adjusting to the light, that I noticed it. His things were not where I thought they would be. My heart skips a beat and my eyes fly to the window that looks into the backyard and our driveway. Fearing a burglar, I rushed to the back door only to find it locked securely. Too afraid to do anything else, I grabbed the cordless phone and hightailed it to my room, locking myself in. This is where the experience was taken to a new level. Sitting in my room, panting and shaking as I held the phone, I could hear and feel as multiple people were walking around on the hardwood floor. Some people even felt like they were stomping. Realizing that I may not be alone, I thought of the only thing a crazed teenage girl could think of. I called my friend across the street. The first friend was a talking whore. I figured she would never answer. I was used to the busy signal, but I had to try. Punching in her number quickly, I brought the phone to my ear and waited. Dial tone. 3 ring. Voicemail. Shit. Dialed up the second friend. I felt like I had a chance. She was never on the phone. Busy signal. Sure. The third friend? The one I was talking to online would answer. Busy signal. Dial up. So I'm sitting there listening to the footsteps and the dial tone as I'm trying to figure out if I should try the first friend again. Static crackled through the dial tone and broke my thoughts. Stared at it. Almost immediately, the static shift from the crackle to laughter and I straight up opened my door and chucked the phone down the hall. The footsteps got louder and I tried to think out a resolution to the problem. I needed the third friend off the internet. I needed someone to validate that I wasn't going crazy and hearing things. But the only way to get her offline would be to go around and get the computer from the first floor. Swallowing hard, I threw open the bedroom door and made a mad dash for the computer. I grabbed the computer and rushed back upstairs. While I was down there, I could hear the footsteps in the other rooms, other than the ones I was in. Rushing back into my bedroom, I hopped back online and forced my friends to get off the internet so I could call her. Retrieving the phone from the hallway, I relocked myself in and dialed her up. When she answered, I recounted what had happened and asked her if she could hear it. For listening purposes, I made my way towards the stairwell, aka fucking wooden echo chamber. Eventually it stopped and then seemed to start back up again, only lights were turning on. Inching down, I realised it was my mother and told the friend that I would talk to her later. After a little talk with my mother, I found out that she'd been home for about 5 minutes. This had all started about 7 p.m. Even if my mother had been way off and arrived 15 minutes before, that would still leave me with 15 minutes of unexplained phenomena. This happened around Christmas time, 2004. It's absolutely true and turned me into a believer of the supernatural. My parents had turned to religion in November of that year by a friend of my younger brother's. This friend had invited my brother to a weekend camp and he came back a Jesus warrior. My dad then went with my brother to see what these outings and meetings were all about and came back converted as well. My mother soon followed. They gathered all sorts of Christian stuff, began holding prayer meetings in their home and began stripping the house of anything non-Christian-like. A week after my family's conversion, with me holding back because this place sounded like a huge cult, weird things began to happen in the house. I still lived with my folks at this time, and we had just moved my grandma in to help her deal with my grandpa's death. Unrelated to the story, just some background. At night, I began to hear noises that sounded like someone walking up and down the stairs. My bedroom was in the basement. Everyone else's bedrooms, the bathroom and kitchen were all upstairs. I was a little creeped out, but dismissed it all as the wind or the house settling, and soon took no notice of it. Then the problems began to escalate. Our VCR, yep, we still had one of those, stove clock, cable box, etc. would randomly flash 666 or 999 and then go back to showing the normal time. The television would try to go to the channel 666, which usually ended up going to 66, then 6. I shouted at whatever it was to stop one day, and the TV just turned right off. My entire family were in the room to witness this. The prayer fest and Bible read that resulted was quite epic, with my parents getting extremely angry that I would have none of it. I was quite fascinated with all this. I had never experienced anything paranormal before. It was scary, but it was just so interesting as well. Soon we could tell the television to turn off or on. My parents yelled Jesus' name at it, placed the Bible on top of the TV, and forbid anyone from touching it. It would turn itself on, but my parents tried very hard to ignore it or would immediately switch it back off. A few more days passed, and now it was affecting my brother's stereo. The prayer group would come over, assemble in the living room, and begin to pray. Suddenly the stereo would turn back on, volume blasting heavy music or static throughout the house. And too scared to touch the actual stereo, my brother unplugged it from the wall and silenced the menace. We all departed the house. My parents said goodnight to the church group, and we went out for dinner at the local White Spot. When we returned, all the candy from the dish on the kitchen counter was arranged in a cross on the stove. Not an upside down one or anything like that, just a cross. My mother, obviously distressed, cleaned up the candy and decided that everyone had to turn in early that night. Her and Dad helped Grandma to bed, then stayed up to read their Bibles. I retired to my room to browse the internet before falling asleep around 2 a.m. I went to work the next day as normal, but when I came home, I found my room had been tossed. I angrily asked my parents what the F was going on, and they told me that the church group had come and gotten rid of all the horrible things I had that was causing the angry spirits to stay in the house. These horrible things were thrown out and or burnt. They were 6 years of sketchbooks, my movie posters, mystery novels, alternative religion books. I had an interest in New Age hooey back then. And my little ceramic animal figurines. I was furious and called a friend to let me stay at their place the night. The next day, after work, I returned home to try and speak some sense into my parents. I was angry, but they were still my parents. I called them to let them know I was returning. Then I arrived a few hours later. We sat down to talk, and suddenly church people emerged from the bedrooms and started chanting psalms and sprinkling oil all over me. I yelled in surprise and stood up, and my mother hugged me and began whispering, "Oh, thank Jesus, thank you, Jesus, it's over, it's over." I tried to break away, now really angry and somewhat scared about what these crazy people thought they could do to me, since they obviously thought I was possessed or something. Suddenly, the candy dish flew off the counter and embedded itself in the far wall. The TV turned on full blast. A picture of my parents was flung off the wall, striking my younger brother on the head. Mum finally let go of me and I ran for the stairs, pausing when I heard a noise in the hall to my left. Pictures began falling off the wall in sequence, one after the other, as if someone was walking towards me, knocking them down as they came down the hall. I made a noise in my throat, but found I couldn't scream, and found myself running down the stairs and out the front door. Behind me, the wardrobe we had in the entryway swung away from the wall and against the bottom of the stairs, blocking anyone else from escaping, except from out the back door and down the porch stairs. I called the same friend in a panic, begging her to come and get me. She arrived half an hour later and we went to her place with nothing but the clothes on my back. I called my parents a week later. Apparently they had the church group do a cleaning and everything had slowed down again. However, they didn't want me coming back to the house and damning the house again. So my friend brought me back long enough to pack a bag and I moved out of my parents' house that day. My parents and I are still on speaking terms and have been since March 2010. They still hear footsteps and such, but nothing like what happened before. They got rid of the old TV, and my old room is now my brother's room. Nothing weird happened in the last few years I lived with my friend. However, my new apartment has some creepy things happen, which I will expand on in further stories. It appears I may have been damning the house after all. In Winter Harbour, Maine, there is a really huge old house. It's very well kept and is absolutely beautiful. Or it would be if it weren't for the fact that every person I've ever known to see it has felt an overwhelming and irrational, "why the fuck is that so creepy?" vibe from it. The first time I saw the house, it made me feel like the house was an old creepy guy staring at me on the subway. Relatively recently, say 7 years or so, A very wealthy family moved into the house. I mean, they would have to be, given the size, age, and location of it. It's a husband and wife, their 2 daughters, who are roughly 7 and 8, respectively, and the house is way too big for them to need that much space. Before I go on, I need to explain to you a little bit of the history of the house. The man who built it was a very wealthy man who built it as a vacation house of sorts, and it's been expanded on over the years, although even the newest part of the house is at least 60 years old. After building the house, initially he eventually sold his house in southern New England and moved his family up to the beautiful mid-coast Maine. His family consisted of his wife, 2 daughters, and his elderly mother, who soon died after. Years passed, and the family lived happily for a long time, until eventually a sickness came to the area. Over the course of 2 years or so, the sickness took every member of the family. Back to the present. One day, my friend is babysitting these 2 adorable little girls who live in the house. One is a strawberry blonde, and the other is a dark-coloured redhead. She met these girls in town before. It's a really small community, and they've always been kind of quiet, but perfectly nice, sweet girls. She says to this day that the second she walked into the foyer, where the girls were waiting with their parents, her inner voice just started screaming, "Get the fuck out," at her. The parents were perfectly pleasant and normal, as always, but the girls were giving just straight up creepy vibes. The mother informs her that the girls want to go play down by the shore at a boathouse that is on the property, but is actually quite far away and through a small copse of woods. Since it's on the way to where the parents are going out to dinner, she'll drive them there, then the girls can lead her back through the woods, which is quicker than the road if you're walking. They know the way, they've been there a million times, both accompanied and unaccompanied, so they all pile into the car and drive down to the shore. It's summer, so they stay at the boathouse for a few hours, and then my friend wants to get back to the house before dark, so she calls the kids to her from where they were playing a little ways away and tells them it's time to go back. The girls just stare at her blankly, and my friend got the "get the fuck away now" vibe again. She's obviously pretty weirded out by this and goes, "Girls, did you hear me? Let's go back." The older girl looks at her confused and says, "Okay, how?" "What do you mean, how? Your mother said you know the way back through the woods." "We've never been here before. What way through the woods?" My friend just stares at them, trying to figure out if she's being pranked or not. The older girl keeps looking confused at my friend, while the younger one maintains a dead blank stare, saying nothing. My friend is really freaked out now, but decides, okay, fine, they don't know the way back. And then they begin walking home, following the road. They get home, she puts the kids to bed, and she spends the rest of the night waiting for the parents, huddled in a blanket in the living room. She was initially in the kitchen, but she said it was giving her bad vibes. When the parents got home, she bolted out of there. But wait, there's more. One day, the mother of those 2 girls is looking through the house after living there for a few months. It's literally so big with so many redundant rooms that there are just parts of the house she hasn't even been in before. So she walks into a sitting room type area with a gorgeous fireplace and a mantelpiece. Above the mantel is a very, very high quality oil painting of her 2 little girls. She is puzzled by this, but assumes that her husband, who pretty much handles all the money, had had it done. Later that night she asks him about it, but he has no idea what she's talking about. She shrugs it off as nothing. A few weeks later, they have a bunch of people from the community over for dinner, one of which considers himself to be an expert on the local history and law. She mentions the painting to him. He hasn't met her girls yet because they are visiting their grandmother, and he has just arrived at his summer home in the town recently. He informs her that the painting is of the original owner's daughters, that was done when they first moved into the house. She continued to stare at the painting, and the more she stares at it, the more she is sure that it is a spitting image of her daughters. If you have a story for me to tell, send me a message on Instagram at LuckyAnOfArt. And of course, as always, thank you.